In an oak-paneled drawing room off Russell Square, 30 paying guests gathered around a long dining table where the entertainment lay under linen, a wrapped Egyptian corpse said to have come from Thebes. Among the Victorian faces, a dismissed housemaid whispered that she heard it sigh before the first cut. Everyone said it was only a curiosity, a medical specimen, an exotic relic. But the reports kept coming. Clocks stopping, candles collapsing in sealed libraries, and letters from guests who woke choking on dust. One strip of fabric, stained dark near the wrist, was later framed behind glass at the British Museum's Department of Egyptian Antiquities. Decades later, Hollywood would soften this story, turning greed and desecration into romantic curse. But in the museum's temperature-controlled vaults, the files remain. Labels uneven, ink blistered, reminders that the first mummy's tomb Westerners opened was often their own conscience. The earliest unwrapping displays in London began in 1823, coinciding with the surge of antiquities following Napoleon's Egyptian campaigns. Dr. Thomas Pettigrew, surgeon and fellow of the Royal Society, hosted these events in rented halls, charging admission under scientific pretense. Surviving ticket stubs in the British Library collection, MS added 45211, describe them as public demonstrations of embalming technique. Household staff who attended these events recalled guests fainting when the linen finally exposed dried eyes and darkened skin. In his private journal, Pettigrew noted one incident. The odor overcame Mrs. C. The bandage slipped, revealing a charm in her mouth, a beetle of lapis. That charm now sits uncatalogued in storage, referenced only as artifact E17 of 3 in acquisition ledgers. The events concluded with polite applause, champagne served in adjacent rooms. None of the records indicate where the bodies were reinterred afterward. Museum archives confirm most were left dismantled in medical college basements, their bandages distributed as souvenirs. This polite institutional forgetting would later ferment into cultural anxiety, and eventually a myth of revenge. By 1835, these unwrappings had become fashionable entertainments. The Royal College of Surgeons hosted 3 in a single winter. A surviving guest list shows nobility mingling with physicians, each paying 5 guineas for what was advertised as educational diversion. The Egypt Exploration Society's correspondence files contain a letter from antiquarian James Burton, who wrote, "The displays have strayed far from scholarly purpose. I witnessed one where a lady wore pieces of the wrapping as a shawl for the remainder of the evening." Between 1840 and 1850, shipping manifests from Alexandria Harbor document the scale of this trade in the dead. Records from 1843 list curiosities, linen, mummified remains bound for Southampton under the broker name H. Salt and Kubin, ostensibly for scholarly inspection. A dock. Worker named James Mills later testified to a parliamentary committee, recorded in Blue Book PG 1845-26, that some chests leaked a sweet pitch black as oil that clung to our boots for days. Collectors competed ruthlessly for novelty. Animal mummies, infant remains, priests with gold leaf inscriptions. The Egyptian government, already under British financial pressure, issued decrees in 1847 banning export, yet customs officers were frequently bribed. The paperwork shows repeated erasures of human remains replaced with plaster figures or decorative artifacts. In letters preserved at the Hunterian Museum, physician Dr. Charles Robinson warned colleagues, "They bring back more than study. The attendants fall ill, the air thickens." One boy refused entry after hearing coughing within the crate. His report was dismissed, filed under anxieties of climate. Still, by 1849, Lloyd's of London began refusing insurance on shipments marked with unfamiliar hieroglyphs. The Times reported in February 1850 that a warehouse clerk in Bristol Harbor fell unconscious while inventorying a shipment from Cairo. When questioned, he insisted the canvas-wrapped figure had moved its fingers in the lamplight. He was dismissed for drunkenness, but 3 co-workers requested transfers that same week. The manifest listed only antiquities scholarly value and was signed by a customs officer who later resigned without explanation. The private evening gathering at Russell Square in 1852 that frames our prologue is uniquely well documented. Invitations printed by H. Foster and Sons list 27 attendees, including medical professionals, aristocrats, and one journalist who later published an anonymous account. The surviving diary of Clara Denton, companion to Lady Beauchamp, recounts, "When the blade touched the chest, gas hissed as if escaping. All watched in frozen civility. The doctor spoke of resin and preservation, while something darker than dust settled on the tablecloth." Within a month, 2 attendees were dead, one of bronchitis, one of unexplained heart failure. The Illustrated London News called it coincidence, noting that winter illness was common. But Pettigrew's own assistant resigned his position, leaving a single note retrieved from museum correspondence: "She will not be touched again." He never returned to collect his final wages. Police archives include a complaint of grave disturbance filed the following week at the Russell Square address. Responding Constable Thomas Webb recorded that furniture was cast about the room without tracks in the dust, and that the household staff refused to enter without religious blessing. The wrappings from this particular mummy, preserved as educational residue, entered the British Museum's collection in 1899 under accession number EA202543. The catalog card, photographed for this research, remains marked "Source Uncertain" in faded brown ink. Museum staff during the cataloging reportedly requested gloves, citing an unpleasant residue that caused skin irritation. The request form survives. The explanation was crossed out by a superior. By 1864, the scale of mummy importation had increased with the expansion of British shipping interests. Port clerks at Tilbury Docks sent 3 separate damage reports to the East India Company headquarters regarding a crate labeled "Sarcophagus Fragile," found open upon arrival, its interior described as "disturbed." The supervising engineer, Henry Lee, wrote in a letter to his family, "There was dust thick as flour across the lid, but none had settled upon the ledgers beside it, as if stirred and replaced again by hand." 2 dockhands fell sick within days of handling the shipment. The Morning Chronicle of March 14, 1864, described a wasting malady among the freightmen of unusual persistence. That same week, spiritualist societies across London began referencing what they called the Restless Ones of Thebes in their publications, adapting the events into seance material that attracted hundreds of paying participants. Museum curators and medical professionals dismissed these accounts as mid-Victorian hysteria, a fashionable fear in drawing rooms. But the original shipping correspondence survives in East India Company archives, neat cursive ink ending in blotted fingerprints that analysis suggests came from multiple hands touching the same paper. A separate incident occurred at Liverpool docks that autumn. Harbor records note that a crate marked Egyptian antiquity was found inexplicably relocated overnight from its storage position. Night watchman Patrick Doyle reported footprints in warehouse dust leading to and from the crate, though no entry was recorded. His supervisor attributed the phenomenon to rats and poor lighting. Doyle requested transfer the following day. The crate was delivered to the home of industrialist William Hesketh, who died 3 months later of respiratory failure. In 1871, the British Museum's Egyptology Wing Maintenance Journal records the dismissal of Eliza Trent, a housekeeper accused of vandalizing a display case. Her statement, preserved in personnel files, claimed she had locked the lady in the glass after hearing weeping like from behind water while polishing brass fixtures after closing hours. The logbook confirms the case was indeed found sealed with an unauthorized padlock. Trent was dismissed for superstition and interference with exhibits. Weeks later, the same case developed a crack in its glass panel. Internal barometer readings from the room showed pressure had dropped sharply overnight. Photographs taken by assistant curator William Greaves show glass shards had fallen inward, not outward, as would be expected from external damage. He annotated his report. Impossible if struck from outside, no explanation satisfactory. Trent's last letter to the museum board, archived in the British Library's ephemera collection, ends with a phrase, in careful script, "Tell them she only wanted to be left whole. The bandages were her clothing for eternity." The letter was marked "No response required" and filed without comment. Museum night staff reported cold spots near the case throughout that winter. Maintenance requisition forms show 3 replacement thermometers ordered for the gallery, each previous one having malfunctioned, showing impossible readings. When the room was renovated in 1873, workers refused to remove the case, citing disagreeable odor that made them lightheaded. It was simply built around, remaining in the same position until 1891. By the late 1870s, scholars like Amelia B. Edwards campaigned to halt the mummy trade on ethical grounds. Her essay, A Million Mummies, published in Harper's Magazine in 1877, condemned railway engineers in Egypt for burning mummy wrappings as locomotive fuel, a practice verified in company records. She wrote, "These are not specimens, but persons, each prepared for an afterlife now interrupted by our curiosity." At a Royal Institution lecture in 1879, the transcripts record an interruption when a heckler shouted, "Then why do the halls stink of Cairo's ghosts?" Laughter noted in the minutes, but quickly struck out by a later hand. The speaker, Egyptologist Samuel Birch, called for scientific respect rather than sensational attribution. That same year, a small fire damaged the University College London Anatomy Laboratory where several mummy fragments were stored. Insurance notes remark that only a mummified arm, reference specimen M19, survived the blaze unmarked by flame despite adjacent materials being reduced to ash. The pattern of burnt shadow on the wall, measured at exactly human width, remained visible for decades beneath new plaster. Former museum night watchman Henry Collins gave a statement to the Society for Psychical Research in 1880, describing movements in the Egyptian halls when all is locked. His testimony was published in their proceedings, but omitted from later editions. Collins died in 1881 of what medical records list as nervous exhaustion. His widow received 3 months' compensation from the museum trustees, though no liability was acknowledged. The catalogue for the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1889 lists a British-lent mummy identified as the Priestess of Amun, 26th dynasty, among the antiquities displayed. Records from the exposition reveal that female cleaning staff refused night duty in all des Antiquités, citing whispering sounds emanating from the crate after dark. Chief Curator Léon Lefebvre wrote to London, "Your object produces a low resonance impossible to reproduce by mechanical means." The message remains logged in Musée d'Orsay technical files marked unresolved. When shipped back to England, customs inspectors noted missing amulets that had been catalogued in the outbound manifest. A Paris journalist for Le Figaro joked that the English lady travels light, leaving her jewelry behind. 2 stevedores working aboard the return voyage on SS Tiberia drowned during the crossing. Their names appear on maritime loss rolls, though no specific causes were noted. Following the exposition, British Museum records show this particular mummy was enclosed permanently in a sealed glass case, the first in the collection to be housed under positive pressure. Staff memoranda referred to it as a precaution against humidity damage. None officially admitted why only that case required a padlock and weekly inspection. Dr. James Purvis, responsible for the new housing, resigned his position 6 months later. His letter cited recurring dreams of suffocation and recommended the specimen be removed from public display. The board minutes note his concerns but conclude, no scientific basis for removal. Specimen remains a valuable educational resource. The case was relocated to a less prominent position in Gallery 42. In 1899, photography was becoming standard for museum documentation, and early X-ray technology was just beginning to reveal secrets beneath wrappings without destruction. Photographer Edmund Ruff, hired to catalog Gallery 64, recorded exposure failure on only one subject, burial case EA 22543. His technical notes preserved in the museum's photography department archives state, all plates black and holy when directed at the case, figure emerges inverted when developed. 5 days after completing his assignment, Ruff collapsed in his darkroom on Museum Street. The medical report filed with the coroner described acute respiratory arrest, as if from inhalation of embalming compounds, though chemical analysis found none present. His widow petitioned for compensation. The museum denied liability, citing voluntary freelance status and pre-existing respiratory weakness. Ruff's remaining photographs, now digitized in the British Library collection, show faint concentric rings surrounding a featureless silhouette where the mummy's image should be. Early curators nicknamed these anomalies the fingerprint of silence in internal correspondence. The photographic division supervisor wrote, "To date, our chemical analysts cannot replicate the pattern under controlled conditions." The British Journal of Photography published a technical analysis of Ruff's plates in 1900, concluding they showed unexplained light leakage. 3 separate attempts to rephotograph the same specimen over the next decade encountered similar difficulties. Equipment malfunction reports cite unexplained static discharge and plate fogging. By 1912, the museum photography department had labeled case EA 22543 as technically challenging and recommended minimal documentation. By 1904, visitor complaint cards began accumulating regarding Gallery 64, describing sensations of vertigo and chest compression near one particular display case. Museum nurse Dorothy Bryant recorded 12 incidents in a single month where visitors required assistance after feeling faint. The museum's own minutes, reference BM OP 1904-112, recommended partial relocation of sensitive materials to less trafficked areas. The episode eventually leaked to The Times, which ran a small article with the headline, "Is the Egyptian Room Harmful?" Skeptical medical authorities blamed poor ventilation and the power of suggestion. Yet that same spring, night watchman John Pullen vanished for 3 hours during his shift. His statement afterward, preserved in staff records. "I was walking the corridor as usual and heard scratching behind glass. Then I was among sand, just sand everywhere." He was discovered near the Great Court entrance, his boots inexplicably filled with fine grit that analysis later showed contained traces of natron salt used in Egyptian mummification. The police medical examiner filed the incident under fatigue-induced delirium. Pullen never returned to work. The problematic case was relabeled simply Unregistered Female, Thebes 19. All reference numbers removed from public view and moved to underground storage, a decision curators later acknowledged was problematic when damage reports began to multiply in adjacent storage rooms. Inventory checks showed inexplicable displacement of artifacts. The department head wrote in a private memorandum, "The specimen appears to repel proximity to other collections." No official explanation was offered for the continued disturbances. Fleet Street journalists discovered a compelling story in these museum disturbances. Between 1909 and 1922, the incidents transformed from institutional inconvenience to public legend. Reporter Bertram Fletcher Robinson interviewed several Egyptologists at the British Museum for a feature series. Following those visits, he fell ill and died suddenly at age 36 of what doctors called typhoid fever, complicated by stress. His colleague Sir Arthur Conan Doyle later cited elemental retribution as the cause, a phrase lifted directly from an 1890 seance transcript Fletcher Robinson had attended. By 1920, with Howard Carter preparing for his expedition to the Valley of the Kings, headlines revived what they now called the London Curse. Daily Mail articles from this period cross-mixed the 1852 Russell Square mummy with emerging Tutankhamun rumors, creating a single composite myth that captured public imagination. Film studio scouts began clipping these newspaper stories, preserved now in Universal Pictures production memos, Box P32, in the Universal Archives. One production note penciled in the margin of these clippings reads, "Let's move it to modern Cairo. Add reincarnated love story." The crime of scientific curiosity would soon be repackaged as supernatural romance for cinema audiences. The British Museum issued a formal statement in 1921 denying any curse or unusual occurrences related to their Egyptian collections. Yet, internal memoranda from the same period show 4 separate maintenance requests for unexplained temperature fluctuation in the storage area housing EA 22543. One technician refused to enter the room alone, citing respiratory discomfort that occurred only inside that space. Screenwriter John L. Balderston, having received the Daily Mail clippings about museum incidents, had himself toured the British Museum while researching the project. Notes in his folder, preserved at UCLA's Cinematic Arts Library, include the observation: real case, female mummy causing deaths in London, base character on that, make her male priest instead for dramatic effect. Thus, the character of Imhotep was born for Universal's production. Names changed, historical context reimagined, ethical questions about desecration erased in favor of forbidden romance. The original violations of a woman's burial transformed into a tale of eternal love. Press releases for The Mummy, 1932, boasted of authentic curse legend, citing, somewhat inaccurately, Lord Carnarvon's death but not the century of violations preceding it. When the film premiered in London, the British Museum tightened its photography rules. An internal memo, BMAA 1932-5, emphasizes the need for respectful behavior around human remains from both visitors and staff. Publicly, museum officials denied any superstitious motivation behind these policy changes. Privately, however, personnel records show 2 staff resignations that same month, citing sustained anxiety dreams of suffocation as their reason for leaving. Both had worked in collections management with access to the Egyptian storage areas. As Boris Karloff's bandaged figure shuffled across movie screens worldwide, dust continued to collect against the sealed glass case in the museum's basement storage, regularly cleaned, yet always reappearing within days. Maintenance logs show weekly cleaning scheduled specifically for this case, unlike the monthly standard for other stored artifacts. During the British Museum's Great Court renovation in 1967, construction plans revealed a forgotten sub-basement vault. Among its contents, wooden crate EA222543A, bearing identical numbering to the Russell Square specimen long presumed destroyed during wartime bombing. Inside were linen fragments mislabeled simply as packing material. Carbon dating later matched them to approximately 600 BCE, consistent with 26th dynasty burials. Curator Margaret Levine ordered a complete recataloguing of these materials. Her oral history interview, Museum Voices Project Tape 17, recorded in 1988, recounts the moment. The lid rose by pressure difference, not touch. A dry breath came out, smelled of almonds. The fragments themselves were unremarkable, but the air had been sealed away for a century. She took early retirement 6 weeks later, citing chronic vertigo that medical tests could not explain. The crate was resealed with modern conservation materials and transferred to a climate-controlled facility off-site. British Museum policy changed significantly after this incident. Since 1999, all human remains from Egypt are to be shown only with ethical interpretation panels acknowledging their origins. The first such panel reads simply, "Once unwrapped for spectacle." Conservation scientist Dr. Alan Pritchard documented unusual preservation patterns in the fabrics from EA 22543A. His research notes indicate that, despite improper storage conditions for decades, degradation is minimal compared to control samples. His paper on the anomalous preservation was rejected by 3 academic journals for methodological concerns. Pritchard later requested transfer to another department. TripAdvisor reviews from 2015 to the present still occasionally mention the cold section of the Egyptian galleries, particularly near cases containing human remains. Security logs record intermittent sensor triggers near the sealed storage areas housing the Russell Square materials, despite redundant calibration and equipment upgrades. New security staff are now briefed to acknowledge respectfully before entering certain storage sections, a protocol officially attributed to cultural sensitivity rather than any specific concerns. In 2017, conservationists examining the case seals found a Victorian hairpin lodged inside a vent seam, identical in design to one listed in Eliza Trent's personal effects inventory from 1871. The pin now sits beside her dismissal letter in the museum's staff history archive, both displayed under glass in a private research area. Museum educator Sophia Chen, interviewed for the institution's oral history project in 2021, described leading student tours through the Egyptian collection. There's always one case where the audio equipment fails. Same spot, different devices. The tech team can't explain it. We just move a few steps away and continue. The case in question houses only textile fragments now, the human remains having been moved to restricted research collections. Yet conservation reports continue to note that electronic monitoring equipment near this display requires more frequent battery replacement than anywhere else in the building. As our footage ends with a slow tracking shot along the mahogany cases, my hand is visible shutting the archival file. On the recording, something faint aligns with airflow microphones, a woman's sigh or simply pressure equalizing after the seal. The camera turns off out of respect.